Yo, what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to the reason our streets switched to cul-de-sacs. They're a weird thing, right? Like cul-de-sacs are one of those things that I don't really fully understand why they are made. I'm gonna guess maybe the people who live in them, it just makes it a bit more private because there's no roads going through your, like past your homes. So yeah, realistically, the only people that are gonna be going through your streets are gonna be people that live in the neighborhood or live in the cul-de-sac. So I assume maybe it's possibly down to that. But in the UK, they are a thing. They're not. I don't think they're as common, but they might be. To be fair, I mean, they're definitely a thing that you see somewhat quite often. But where I live, there's not many. No, there's not any actually. There's no cul-de-sacs in my sort of neighborhood or my area that I live in within my city. But there's definitely cul-de-sacs throughout my city that I've seen, and I think my sister actually used to live in one. But yeah, we're going to see why these are a thing, I guess, or why the US switched to them. And also, I guess, the reasoning behind it. Because, well, yeah, that's literally what it says, the reasons. Because I don't actually understand what the point of a cul-de-sac is, other than, like, privacy, like I sort of said. But we're going to check this out. Hopefully you're going to enjoy. And, yeah, let's jump into this reaction.
Sponsored by Skillshare. Get 2 months of free access to over 25,000 courses by visiting the rigid gridiron pattern. You can see this in cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. It was the way city streets were planned for over a century. But that changed in the 1930s and 1940s as new development came with a new street pattern, loops and cul-de-sacs. New neighborhoods barely connected to one another either. This street pattern became one of the defining characteristics of urban sprawl. Why did we change how we designed our street networks?
Here we go.
Ever since the Land Ordinance of 1785, the United States embraced the grid. The law divided much of the United States into square-mile grid cells, and later acts extended the grid all the way to the Pacific. Cities followed suit, either using those national grids as a starting point or designing their own grid, often to match local topographic and geographic features. Grids made it easy to subdivide and sell land, perfect for a rapidly expanding country. I have a whole video on this topic of grids if you want to go check it out. If grids were so great, why did we switch to the disconnected networks we build now? Well, for one thing, we didn't switch all at once. There was a brief transition period from about 1900 to 1930. Those dates correspond to the growth and development of the automobile, as well as when the streetcars were most popular. Streetcar suburbs were typically laid out in the same grid pattern that made land speculation so easy. It also made it easy for people to walk to nearby streetcar stops. But as cars became more popular, real estate developers could design neighborhoods, often referred to as subdivisions, that didn't need to be near streetcar stops. These new subdivisions could also be smaller, as they didn't have to pay for the cost of a streetcar line. What you got were smaller, more irregular subdivisions in odd places. The roads in these subdivisions would often not connect to each other, and the road networks were often not as well thought out. Cities at the time didn't have any way of forcing developers to design better street systems or cooperate with each other. The federal government eventually drafted a Standard City Planning Enabling Act in 1928 that states adopted. These rules allowed cities to adopt citywide street plans and regulate the design of subdivisions. So that tells us why we moved away from the grid, but it doesn't tell us how we got to the loops and the cul-de-sacs of today. Most subdivision regulations found in cities don't explicitly say that new residential areas have to have loops and cul-de-sacs. So what happened next? The Great Depression happened. Suddenly, you had a lot of people who needed
down to the Great Depression,
affordable housing, and a shaky banking system that was often unwilling or unable to make loans to homebuyers and housing developers. This is where the federal government stepped in and created the Federal Housing Administration. The FHA would underwrite the loans of new housing developments, making the investment less of a risk to bankers. But they would only underwrite sound investments, and they considered the design of the subdivision when making that determination. This put the FHA in a position of significant power over suburban residential design. Developers didn't put up a fight and went along with the FHA subdivision design recommendations. So what did they recommend? The hot new planning trend at the time was called the neighborhood unit. Here's a sample neighborhood. The basic features of the neighborhood unit are a size that matches the attendance boundary for an elementary school, located at the center of the neighborhood. Busy streets at the edges, with no through traffic in smaller neighborhood streets. Shops located on the edges along busy streets, with libraries and parks in the interior. No gridiron, but instead streets designed to connect to places where people wanted to go. You can sort of see how the neighborhood unit gets us closer to suburban sprawl street patterns.
See, this makes sense. Is this actually how it is, though? Would you find, like, the average neighborhood in the US with this sort of list of things, like, being there? I guess it depends where you are.
Imagine strip malls along those suburban arterial streets. Real estate developers designed their subdivisions according to neighborhood unit principles to get the funding they needed for their housing. The result was a lot of disconnected networks that didn't connect the way they used to with the grids. But this doesn't explain cul-de-sacs. Where did they come from? Cul-de-sacs first made an appearance in the Garden Cities era from about 1900 to 1935. They were designed as a refuge from streets that were increasingly full of loud, fast-moving cars.
I guess that's what I said then, the privacy. Which does make sense, to be fair.
Street patterns with a lot of cul-de-sacs use less asphalt and concrete, which saved developers money. And because they only handled local traffic, cul-de-sacs could be narrower, another win for developers. Despite the benefits of cul-de-sacs and their use in some influential Garden City projects, it took a while for them to catch on. They weren't even prominently used in example neighborhood unit communities. Their popularity comes from a pretty mundane source: engineering design standards. Transportation engineering emerged as a separate field from civil engineering in the 1920s, and in 1931, 30 engineers got together to form the Institute of Transportation Engineers. This organization is notable for publishing design standards for the road building industry. They became the design manuals engineers grabbed when they laid out subdivisions. The ITE, in its 1965 publication, Recommended Practice for Subdivision Streets, recommended that subdivisions should discourage through traffic, four-way intersections should be avoided in favor of T intersections. Curvilinear patterns, loops, and cul-de-sacs should be used to encourage slow-moving traffic. T intersections were encouraged because of an engineering study that compared crash rates between gridded neighborhoods and FHA neighborhood unit neighborhoods. The study found that there were almost 8 times the crashes in gridded networks. They also found that T intersections had no crashes
They had no idea that they were both coming. God damn.
at all. They concluded that for
So I guess the idea is it stops you from just constantly just driving through. Like, you have to stop, you have to then go left, and then you have to go continuing the direction you were going. I mean, it makes sense. It probably would also help that there was traffic lights or something. Like, what's stopping these people from seeing each other? I guess it's just a general thing of when you're used to driving on these, maybe you're just so used to it, you just don't stop. I mean, they can definitely see each other. But this car is going a lot quicker, isn't it? This car is like, you're looking at this and like thinking, how are they going to crash at this point? Because this car's got so much less distance to travel.
8 times the crashes
It's going so much slower.
in gridded networks. They also found that T intersections had no crashes at all. They concluded that for safety's sake, neighborhoods should be full of cul-de-sacs, T intersections, and convoluted street patterns.
Damn.
Subsequent updates through 1990 did little to change these recommendations. The period between the first publication in 1965 and 1990 saw a huge residential building boom in the United States, and engineers at the time used those ITE standards. So that's how we got
So
from
this is now how a US city looks. I'm not a US city, like suburbs and stuff. I mean, it's definitely interesting because this is not how you picture it in general, but I guess US suburbs are a lot more twisty and turny, like he's explained the regulations and stuff. There's loads of cul-de-sac. Okay, yeah, the US just loves a cul-de-sac then. In this picture alone, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 just in this region. And there's not really any this side. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Oh yeah, the US 12. The US loves a cul-de-sac. Damn. I didn't know it was this much. But it makes sense. It does make sense.
those ITE standards. So that's how we got from the gridded streets of the 19th century to the disconnected mess of today. This is primarily a result of the institutionalization of street design standards, first by the federal government, then by industry organizations. Once something becomes standard practice, it's really hard to change. Now, you may have noticed in this video I talk about these disconnected street patterns with somewhat of a negative tone. And that's because building streets like this makes it really hard to use any kind of transportation option besides a car. Circuitous streets make walking and biking trips longer, which can discourage people from doing that at all. Grids are far more flexible. You can turn grids into cul-de-sacs, but it's a lot harder to take down houses to turn cul-de-sacs into grids.
What? So is he saying this should be like a sort of a man-made cul-de-sac, just stopping traffic from going down here? I mean, fair enough. It's not the prettiest thing, but I guess it does make sense for this sort of the idea that he's saying. It's just such a weird thing to see. But to be fair, you do get this sort of stuff in my city as well. It's not like this, but you'll just have like poles, basically. Like, so let's just say there's a road here, There's a road here. There's poles that are up, and yeah, they're pretty much up to stop people from driving across. So they have to go around and then get to here. I guess it's just to sort of stop it getting busier there. I don't actually fully know, but I've definitely seen stuff like this before, to be fair.
Thankfully, cities have begun to rethink their subdivision street design standards, and we're seeing networks with more connections for pedestrians and cyclists. The next phase of residential street design could be some sort of hybrid, where cul-de-sacs still exist because people love to live on them, but there are paths for other modes. Some places already have these path systems, and it's something we could see more of in the future.
But to be fair, I mean, if you are talking about like public transport, let's just say you live here, surely there'll be a bus that comes and stops, like, you get a bus that stops like here or something, because it's going all the way around anyway. So people that live on these areas, a little short walk, because let's not take the piss, like, in England, you're not going to have a bus stop for every person. Like, people are going to have to walk to their closest bus stops. And sometimes it'll be a good 5-10 minute walk. Like, that's just how it's going to be. Maybe not 10 minutes. 5 minute walk, a bit more than that. Maybe a bit more than 5 minutes. But you're going to have to walk a little bit. But yeah, you just have it down here, one here, and then just dotted around. But I guess I do get the idea of what he's saying, but there's definitely ways around it.
And it's something we could see more of in the future. So the set behind me is pretty new. It's certainly better than when I started, and I was talking to a friend.
He's getting an ad. Go on, lad. But yeah, there we go. In India, we just stopped planning cities. Fair enough. What helpful unintended cities skylines tutorial. In the Netherlands, we don't do cul-de-sacs. Our version of a cul-de-sac is a street which just stops suddenly, and you have to figure out how to turn your car. To be fair, there's actually certain streets. I wish I could go on Google Maps and show, because there's, again, cul-de-sacs, you occasionally get them in my city, and in England I feel like they're somewhat common, but sometimes you'll just have where a street just ends. There'll be a house at the end of the street, and then it just go backwards, like you've got to go back the other way. It's like a sort of a cul-de-sac, but without the circular thing that helps you actually get around the cul-de-sac and get back out. Pretty much like what this person's describing. I first had to Google what a cul-de-sac is, but I ended up in a dead end. Okay. I think that's where we end this video. But yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this reaction. Let me know your thoughts on this. And until next time, like, subscribe, and peace.